is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsen. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special unscripted episode of Bean to Barstool. This is sort of unofficially our 4-year anniversary episode. Our 4-year anniversary of the first episodes we released was actually back in August. So this is just kind of unofficially looking back at what we've done so far and what we still have ahead. Anytime you're looking back at a business or a project that you've created, there are always so many different milestones and anniversaries that you can check off. When you first got the idea, when you came up with a name, when you bought a URL, all sorts of different stuff. And the idea for Bean to Barstool, or at least the seeds of it, go well back before I actually even came up with the official idea. Back in 2019, I was trying to think through what my corner of beer writing was going to be, kind of what the niche was that I was going to try to carve out and define as my own. I was just beginning to cover craft chocolate as well, and I knew the stories that I was finding fascinating in kind of a you know it when you see it sort of way, but I was having trouble piecing together what was actually common between them. And at some point it just kind of clicked that it came down to the interaction between flavor and story and the way that specific sensory experiences can inform and amplify the story behind how those flavors came to be, and correspondingly how learning about the story of an ingredient or a beer, a chocolate, another artisan product can inform how we perceive the flavors of that when we finally get to it, which is an interesting enough concept, but is also kind of convoluted and not very concrete. So I was looking at all these different stories I'd written and the stories that I wanted to write, and that was the gravitational center of them, but I hadn't really been able to put words around it yet. And that started to coalesce and kind of come together toward the end of 2019. I realized that if I was going to create a project for myself that was independent of just the articles that I was writing as a freelancer, that I wanted it to include both beer and chocolate. Beer media was already beginning to get a little bit more challenging by that time, right as I was really getting my legs under me as a full-time writer. And craft chocolate is still a small enough world that there existed no publication dedicated to craft chocolate. There still doesn't. We'll get to that in a little bit. We had a short window of a very good chocolate magazine called Cacao that I was privileged to write for, but they were only able to get a few issues out. So they are no more, and we're back to having no craft chocolate publication. And the beer writing world has only gotten more challenging over the last 4 or 5 years. We've had some publications close down, and rates, it feels like, continue to drop in different markets. And in 2019, as I was honestly just really becoming established as a beer writer, I realized that I wanted some kind of platform that would be independently mine, and whether or not I would ever be able to make money off of it, it would at least be a platform from which I could commission other work or send people back to kind of see what I was all about. So I came up with the idea for Bean to Barstool. The name actually came about because of a project I was supposed to take on with another chocolate writer. We had both spoken at an event here in Dayton, Ohio called Learn, Love, Eat that was all about the interaction of flavor from different artisan segments with deeper aspects of who we are. So I gave a talk on beer. There was somebody doing a presentation on coffee, bourbon, and this other chocolate writer was giving a tasting of Bean to Bar chocolate. And we got connected, started talking, found a lot of commonalities in what we were interested in, and discussed doing some kind of column, like pitching a column for a publication about beverage alcohol and chocolate. It ended up falling through and we didn't end up actually pursuing it, but I did end up brainstorming the idea of Bean to Barstool, and I loved it so much that I knew I needed to use it for something. So at the beginning of 2020, I decided that this was a project I wanted to take on. I was sitting with Melinda, my wife, at Table 33, a little restaurant in downtown Dayton. It's right across the street from the Schuster Center, our big performing arts center. And we were about to go see Rent on stage for the first time. So we were having dinner at Table 33, and I kind of pitched this idea of what I wanted to do. And of course, she was entirely supportive of it. So I set the plan in motion to launch Bean to Barstool, and then the pandemic hit in March, and suddenly I had the free time to actually build this out and figure out how to podcast, what kind of mic I needed, how do you record audio, all that kind of stuff. So did that across the course of the spring and the summer, and launched the first episodes of Bean to Barstool in August of 2020. And if you go back and listen to those early episodes, they are very high concept and very, very personal. On the first part of that, every single episode, I was interviewing multiple people. I was breaking up those episodes into individual segments and doing a bunch of narration in between, almost like an NPR show where I was doing like investigative journalism around some like concept of flavor or ingredients. And it was fun, and I like those episodes, but they were so much work. I was putting in too many hours every week for something that I was not getting paid for. And I'm proud of those episodes, but we ended up needing to move away from them to something that was a little bit more streamlined and sustainable. But if you go back and listen to those, you can see kind of the original vision of what Bean to Barstool was in my imagination before rubber actually hit the road and I had to start producing episodes every single week. They were also very, very personal. I was doing a lot of kind of vulnerable personal narration. I am proud to have had that involved there, but that also really wasn't sustainable as an every single episode thing. It is something I've gotten away from, I think, a little too much, and I'd like to go back to adding a little bit more personality and personal story into what we're doing here. So I will be looking for ways to do that. When you launch a podcast, and I've heard this from other podcasters, your first episode is forever your most popular episode in terms of total downloads, unless you have some specific episode that ends up going viral later in your run or something. That first one is going to be the first thing people go back to listen to. And it's kind of frustrating because your first episode is almost definitely not your best episode. You're still figuring out what you're doing. But for better or worse, that's where people often start. And for a while, I felt kind of angsty about that, about my very first episode. But now, 4 years on, I've got enough distance from it to kind of appreciate those first few. The very first episode was actually based on the talk I had given at Learn, Love, Eat, where I had originally connected with the other chocolate writer. It was all about the personal flavor vocabularies that we each carry with us based on experiences we've had in life. So our cultural background, where we grew up, where we've lived geographically, our religious and socioeconomic backgrounds, all sorts of different things that influence what words we use to describe flavors and aromas, and how we can expand those vocabularies, and what can happen really dynamically when people with those different vocabularies get together to taste together, and how we can use that as an invitation to learn more about each other's stories through the process of tasting beer, of tasting chocolate, of tasting whatever. It's a really dynamic concept, and something that I have tried to weave into a lot of my work since then.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Fifth Street Brew Pub in Dayton, Ohio is one of our sponsors at Bean to Barstool and Final Gravity, our print beer zine, and they just happen to be one of my favorite hometown breweries. They're one of the only cooperatively owned breweries in the country, a testament to their community focus and support. Inside a building from the 1850s in the historic neighborhood of St. Anne's Hill, Fifth Street Brew Pub offers a warm, cozy atmosphere and excellent beer and food. And you can take your favorite beers to go with their Gem City swing tops, elegant swing top bottles filled straight from the taps with regular favorites like St. Anne's Pils and Rough Gem Farmhouse Ale, or whatever their current seasonals are. I recently had a Sage Pilsner from them that was fantastic. Sage is one of those flavors that can get away from you really quickly, but they used it in a really graceful way in this beer. Loved it. If you're in the Dayton area, head over to Fifth Street to hang out or grab beer to go, and if you're visiting Dayton, and you should, make sure Fifth Street is on your list. Cheers. The episodes that I'm doing now, if you're a faithful listener, thank you if you are, are more streamlined than that. They're typically a little bit more topical. Usually I've got one interview subject and we're looking at a particular topic. Those are easier to produce, if I'm completely honest. They are quicker to produce. They are fascinating to me still. I pick topics that I find really, really interesting, but I would like to be able to weave in some of those deeper themes more often. So as I look toward the future of this podcast, I will be looking at ways to do that. The following of Bean to Barstool is still fairly small. Our listenership is lower than a lot of people would expect. We do have a very engaged listener base, so I'm really grateful to all of you who listen every week and comment on social media. I think the folks who follow Bean to Barstool really like it, but it is a smaller listener base than I might have expected after 4 years, and I think some of that is the fact that we're looking at a very niche topic. I mean, the intersections between beer and chocolate, while there are so many stories to tell there and so many interesting subtopics that I continue to find, it is still a very, very small corner of the beer world, of the chocolate world. And I think what I had originally had in mind was that by bringing these two things together, it would expand the reach, that everybody interested in beer, everybody interested in chocolate would now be able to be interested in this. In reality, and I've talked to a few other professionals who have brought together different segments like this, and this seems to be the case. In reality, it actually kind of shrinks the potential base a little bit because only folks who are interested in both topics are maybe willing to dive in on that. There's a built-in limitation, I think, to the size of Bean to Barstool, but the folks who listen and are dedicated seem to really, really be engaged. I'm very grateful for that. At the beginning of 2021, a lot of these sort of landmarks happen at the beginning of the year because in the week between Christmas and New Year's every year, I typically spend the entire week just with a notebook in hand doing brainstorming and looking ahead to what goals I have professionally for the next year, what kinds of things I want to change. So at the beginning of 2021, I had set in mind that I wanted to become kind of the voice for beer and chocolate, whether that was pairing, brewing with cacao, making chocolate with beer or beer ingredients, collaborations between these, all the stuff that I do with Bean to Barstool. I wanted to kind of become better known for that. So I made some specific goals in terms of the articles that I wanted to pitch and how I wanted to get the word out about what I was doing. I think that has been fairly successful. Most of my colleagues in beer, I think, know me for that. That said, this still being such a niche, there are a lot of folks in both beer and chocolate who might have an interest in this who still have not heard about it. So there's still work to be done there. In 2022, I realized there was no standalone published guide out there on pairing beer and chocolate like existed for a lot of other pairing, specific sub-interests. So I wrote a standalone zine called Pairing Beer and Chocolate that was published by Bean to Barstool. We have since published quite a few other standalone zines, and we actually have 2 coming up by other authors that are about specific aspects of the history of cacao and chocolate in Central and South America. One of those will be coming out before the end of the year. The other will most likely be out in the first quarter of 2025. But that zine was very well received. Earlier this year, we actually expanded that. I expanded it and redesigned it and published it as a paperback book that you can now order from beantobarstool.com. It's the only book in existence on pairing beer and chocolate. That has been received well and has brought some nice opportunities for doing more pairing events. If you are a chocolate maker or a brewery or other business and you're interested in stocking that book or hosting a pairing, please do reach out. I'd love to talk to you about that. As I look ahead to the future of Bean to Barstool, there's a few specific things that I would like to see happen. For one, I'd love to expand our coverage beyond just beer and chocolate to encompass more beverage categories: wine, spirits, cocktails, coffee, tea, looking at all of those in interaction with craft chocolate, looking at the use of specific ingredients, looking at pairings, telling stories and exploring flavor, kind of what we've been doing all along, but just expanding that beyond beer and chocolate. To really do that well, the coverage has to go beyond me. I'd like to start getting more contributors on the blog, getting more guest hosts for the podcast. To do that in the way that I want to means we need to be able to pay those contributors. Right now, Bean to Barstool is not monetized from an advertising standpoint. We sell zines and the book through the shop on there, but we don't directly monetize content. And I want to be careful about how we do that to maintain the integrity of what we're doing. But I do think we need to be able to bring in some money to be able to justify that. If your business would love to sponsor a particular article or podcast episode or something like that, please do get in touch, because we're looking for creative ways to be able to fund that. I want to provide a place for chocolate coverage, which right now doesn't really exist, and a way to tell these kind of like niche stories that don't really have a home anywhere else. So definitely reach out if you want to help me brainstorm with how to do that. One of the things I've discovered about myself in my writing career is that I tend to kind of fall in love with anybody I interview, or I guess more specifically, I fall in love with whatever the topic is that I'm interviewing them about or writing about. A few years ago, sat in on a presentation by the National Honey Board about monofloral honeys and spent about 2 hours pretty convinced that I was going to become a honey sommelier, because this was all just so fascinating. And any producer I interview, any subtopic that I fall down the rabbit hole with, becomes my favorite thing for the duration of that afternoon or whatever. And I love that about myself, because I'm a curious person and I always want to follow that curiosity. With that said, I often wonder why the intersection of beer and chocolate grabbed hold of my brain in the way that it did. And a lot of times with our interests, I feel like there's just a certain irreducible complexity where we turn toward a certain thing and the light starts flashing, and like we don't really know exactly what it is that has made us so fascinated. I think this is kind of what Yeats was getting at with Lonely Impulse of Delight. And he's got the one famous poem where someone is describing why they love doing a certain thing, and they list they list a bunch of things that they like about it, but then one by one kind of dismantle those and say that, they could get that satisfied somewhere else. And in the end, it's just a lonely impulse of delight. It's just something where your mind and your soul just kind of resonate with this, and you're never going to be able to put into words exactly what it is. I'm not exactly sure why this became that for me, but I have found it to be kind of a never-ending well of curiosity and inspiration. I think it could have been something else, but it ended up being this. We publish through Bean to Barstool, we publish a quarterly beer zine called Final Gravity. Many of you are readers and supporters. Thank you for that. And we try to publish kind of unusual articles that maybe wouldn't find a home in a lot of other beer outlets. We have one coming up in our next issue by Grace Lee Whites. It's about Hanabi lagers, this one particular lager maker out of California. They only brew a couple times a year, and every single batch they brew is kind of obsessively oriented around one rare and hard to find grain. And like, this is just their thing. And as I was reading it, it's a great article. As I was reading it, it's like, yeah, I could imagine that being me, a different life. That could have been what it was, you know, and I love finding people who have just obsessively devoted themselves to one particular fascination. Looking ahead, I still believe there are amazing stories to be told in beer, in chocolate, in both of them together. We are trying to publish a lot of those through Final Gravity. I want to publish some through the Bean to Barstool site. On the chocolate side, we have talked about the idea of launching a chocolate equivalent of Final Gravity, some sort of periodical that would be a home for writing about craft chocolate, because as I mentioned earlier, nothing currently exists, which is just kind of amazing. So we're talking about that idea. I know some of you have discussed that with, it's just an issue of having the time to be able to get that off the ground, but it is definitely something we're looking at. I still really believe that flavor is an invitation that can help us understand ourselves and each other better. I still believe that flavor is story, that flavor and story inform each other and interact, and that our senses can help tell the story behind a particular beer or chocolate or other artisan food or beverage. At some point in the beer world, it became uncool to care about the beer itself. This is a conversation that comes up with other beer writers, where for a long time beer writing was just sort of this like geeky insiders club where you just talked about the beer. You talked about the people who make it, the ingredients, the processes, and there was definitely a time and place for that. And then within the last few years, we've gotten away from that, and it's almost become like you're not supposed to care about the beer. You're supposed to just write about the other personal or cultural things around that, or the a more quote unquote mature business perspective on beer. And I get all the reasons for that, and that is all important, but I think we still have to care about the product. We still have to kind of geek out about beer and think that these flavors and these histories and these styles and these ingredients and all of this is interesting, or otherwise eventually I think we're writing ourselves out of business. And on the chocolate side, chocolate is a much younger industry than beer. Chocolate folks still seem to really love chocolate and get geeky about chocolate, and please keep that. Please hold on to it even as the industry grows and matures. Way back at the beginning of Bean to Barstool, I was using the sentence for marketing that you could think of Bean to Barstool as a dream journal written in the complex alphabet of beer and the eloquent vocabulary of chocolate. I have no idea exactly what that meant, but I know that I really, really felt it, and I do love the idea, and I believe that our experience of flavor and our interaction with beer and chocolate is holistic. It goes far beyond just a mental comprehension. It goes beyond just a sensory interaction. It encompasses so many aspects of who we are. To those of you who have been listening to Bean to Barstool from the beginning, or who have joined more recently but are devoted listeners, thank you so much. It means so much to me. I always want to hear your thoughts. If you had a thought about a specific episode or blog post or something else, please let me know. I always want your input. I'd love to hear what you would like to hear more about. As I mentioned earlier, we want to expand into some new areas of coverage. We want to grow Bean to Barstool. That can only happen if the readership and the listenership grows along with it. So tell your friends, tell chocolate makers, tell brewers, tell growers, let them know if you really appreciate what Bean to Barstool is about, and we can hopefully grow this together. If you are in one of those industries in a business capacity and you would like to work with us in some way, please reach out. We have creative ways that we can look at doing that and working together. Other ways you can help Bean to Barstool include leaving reviews on podcast sites, sharing our content on social media. We do have a Patreon, although it is primarily oriented around Final Gravity, our print zine, but it does also go to support Bean to Barstool. Let us know your favorite episodes. I would love to hear what you've enjoyed most as we continue to plan future content. I'm just getting started with Bean to Barstool. I'm hoping that this project continues to grow. Thanks for coming along with me on this journey so far. I hope you've enjoyed what you've listened to and what you've read so far. Cheers.